The presentation topic here is the United States and world federalism. And I'm going to introduce a thesis that is unique, but in the context of the deep state and what we've discussed so far, I think will make a lot of sense. What I'm going to suggest in the creation of the United States Constitution that was ratified in 1789 was a necessary step toward the development of world federalism, what some people call world empire. So I want to establish a couple terms. First of all, when we think of world federalism, let's just focus on that word federalism for a moment. Federalism is a type of compound government. So let's think about it in real simple terms. In the United States, we have one government with one constitution in Washington, D.C. that represent the citizens of the entire nation of the United States. And then we have 50 separate governments inside of our states, each with its own constitution. And this was planned in a way that one government would function along with, but perhaps also be subordinate to the other government. This is the story of American politics, this relationship between the state governments and the federal governments. But my attempt here is to explain this in a way that we don't get into the dryness of this. I really want to cut to the chase as much as we can. So the creation of federalism in the United States Constitution, the arguments for creating this kind of state government, federal government, composite, compound, republic, whatever words they used, the arguments and debates to make that happen really unleashed the potential for a perpetual movement from federal forms of government around the world into this ultimate world federalism construction that we see evolving before us today. So what I'd like to argue right now is that the world history, we can see a process of framing, that we see a process of integration and disintegration, integration and separation, all the way from the very first empire unto the Anglo-American empire that we have today. So the project of empire is to pull up surrounding political systems, be they city-states, be they tribes, kingdoms. They pull in different groups of people, create a common language, culture, economic infrastructure, and nations then have a rise and fall according to these ebbs and flows of the rise and falls of empire. Now, such an idea of a sort of federated system, sort of a government operating within a government or a sub-government within an empire, is nothing entirely new. And one example would be, some might be familiar with a biblical example of Judea existed inside of the Roman Empire, and the people inside of Judea had some sovereignty over their affairs. For example, in the Bible, legally they could stone a person to death, but to crucify somebody, they would need permission from one of the delegates from the empire. This is just one example of a government inside of a government. And of course, we're talking about visible governments here. And the argument to create a government inside the United States created the first constitutional federal state relationship that we have now, that was sort of a copy for other governments, that was actually written out in a form that there'd be one government and have some kind of ambiguous relationship with another government. They might be co-equals. One might be subservient to the other. And again, that's the relationship in the United States. Generally, we think of it as the states were dominant over the federal government in the 19th century, and that relationship was inverted in the 20th century. But today we find federalisms or models of it: Canada, Mexico, Brazil, Germany, Switzerland, Australia, and India. It's a part of many of the democratic arrangements of government throughout the world. And arguably the United States was the first that created this out of a written constitution, in other words, by design. So we have to get to the very goal, the intentions of creating a particular government in the United States. The United States, when we think of the Declaration of Independence in 1776, the United States was purported to create a country that was separate from the empire that was Great Britain. This empire that had extracted land and resources and peoples from around the world, gave them a common language and a common culture. The colonists, the citizens of the United States that were subject to the British throne, wanted a separation from that throne, a legal separation. That's what the Declaration of Independence was about. And the purpose, according to the Declaration of Independence, is this sort of idea of natural law. Humans are endowed by their creator with certain natural rights: life, liberty, the pursuit of happiness, private property. And under that assumption, which grabs in the idea of a transcendental universe and a God and or creator that gives rights to people, the accusation was that the British Empire and that form of government was not allowing citizens to pursue their God-given rights in this form of government. So the idea is the thinkers inside the United States sat down and puzzled. They looked over constitutions, written and unwritten throughout the ages. And the question at hand was how to create the freest people that had ever existed. They thought that themselves, the colonists of Great Britain in the United States, were the freest under the British constitutional arrangement. However, they wanted to take it to the next level. And so the argument was, how could individuals have the maximum amount of freedom of mind, body, property? And when they looked at the freest people that had ever existed and the forms of government that they were attached to, the idea was that the Republican form of government would be the best safeguard to protect individual liberties. So they went especially to thinkers like Machiavelli from the early 1500s and Montesquieu, the French thinker, who wrote The Spirit of the Laws in 1748. And the idea here that to create the freest people in the world, it really boiled down to the idea that the political system had to be geographically small. In other words, it had to function almost as the antithesis of an empire that expanded perhaps forever, including. So the empire as a formula, as a political organization, was the antithesis in the minds of the framers of the United States in creating a free people. It allowed them to some extent to be free under that arrangement. To bring it to the next level, they had to create what they thought was a republic. A republic works for the idea that there's a common good of people that should be able to have their own destiny at hand. It's a government to that extent based upon consent for the people, and this idea that there's a common good, sort of a good that transcends each individual's kind of wants and needs. It's a slightly theological concept. But the most important idea is that a Republican form of government had to be small, maybe let's say the size of Kentucky, somewhere where the average person could see the people in power, could participate in government, because you could sort of be a part and attached to all the economic and political and social activities around you. So if it was small, everybody was sort of accountable to one another. In other words, it would be sort of harder to have invisible forces sort of penetrate into that body politics if it were small. It could be sort of hermeneutically or hermetically sealed. If it were small, contained, everything would be more or less transparent. That would be the idea of the most perfect form of government. And so when we really think about, and I want you to think about this, the document in 1776, the Declaration of Independence, is a document, one that is going to be a divorce from Britain, but also from the form of government of empire as represented by the United Kingdom or Great Britain. And number two, it was a document stressing where do rights come from? Why can we claim that we can be sovereign from a king, from a theistic relationship between the lawmakers and the lawgiver? And so really at hand, the enemy of this republican form of government, those forms of power, insidious, perhaps invisible, that were going to problematize this form of government would be empire. And specifically, according to the framers, along with the notion of empire, it would be forces of oligarchy. It would be family structures that had existed to create government.